Very good morning. Welcome and welcome back to those of you who have been joining us since December 7, when we started our Decolonization at 60 series of events. So thank you for joining today for the final book talk, the final decolonization book talk hosted at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. I'm your host, Joita Sarkar. I'm an assistant professor here at the BU Pardee School and also the director of the Global Decolonization Initiative that is hosting this event. This event is made possible because of the support of the Pardee School, the Center for the Study of Asia, the African Studies Center, and the Institute for Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. It is also co-sponsored by the Society for Advancing the History of South Asia, and we actually had the president, Michelle Lowrow, discussing her edited volume on December 7th on League Against Imperialism. This book talk is, as I said, part of Decolonization at 60, which is the series of events we've been hosting on the 60th anniversary of the UN General Assembly resolution, which was yesterday, December 14, on the decolonization resolution, formerly called the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. So a quick point to all of you, we're about 16 of us. This event is being recorded and many of us cannot join, so for them it will be there. But if you do not wish to be recorded, then please mute your audio and video functions. Also during the Q&A, if you have questions but you do not wish to be recorded, send it in the chat to everyone and we will get to you before the end of our time. Great, so let's begin with the introductions. We are thrilled to have with us today three renowned historians. We have a terrific panel to discuss Professor Andrew Rotter's latest book. We all have a copy, Empires of the Senses, Bodily Encounters in Imperial India and the Philippines. It was published last year by Oxford University Press. I first met Andy at AHA several years back when I was a graduate student, and I was an anxious grad student in Geneva, and I had just finished reading his Comrades at Odds book, with United States and India, 1947 to 64. And as you might imagine, I was in awe of our author, and I was even more amazed at how down to earth he was. He just sat down, on the outskirts of a panel, just listened to my half-baked ideas from my dissertation work. So Andy, it's not just a delight to host you. It is really an honor to have you with us to host your book talk. Professor Andrew Rotter is Charles A. Dana Professor of History at Colgate University, where he has taught since 1988. Andy has published numerous books, including The Path to Vietnam, Comrades at Odds, Hiroshima, the World's Bomb, and most recently, Empires of the Senses, for which we are gathered here today. Next will be joining us imminently, my dear colleague from BU.
Sorry, I'm texting with Ben right now. He's got the time wrong. He's got it as 12 Eastern. So I'm going to try to see what's going on, but he had the wrong time.
Oh, okay. So he will definitely join us in a bit. Thanks so much, Brooke. Hopefully,
yes.
So next is my dear colleague who will join us imminently. He's really coming in from Italy, and so there are some challenges there, time zone differences. And calculation of time zone differences. So Ben is assistant professor of history at Boston University, and his first book, Hungry Nation, published in 2018, interrogated the ways in which questions of food and scarcity structured Indian citizens' understanding of welfare and citizenship since independence. And his next book, Markets of Pain, a transnational history of the United States opioid crisis, is under contract to be published with Oxford. Finally, we have Professor Christopher Capozzola, who joins us, just across the Charles. Chris is professor of history at MIT, where he teaches courses in political and legal history, war and the military, and the history of international migration. His first book, Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of Modern American Citizen, with Oxford, won the Lois P. Rudnick Book Prize of the New England American Studies Association. And his most recent book was published earlier this year, Bound by War, How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Pacific Century. So I extend a warm welcome to all our panelists, and I also welcome all our audience who are joining us from multiple time zones and certainly historiographies, as I can see. So Andy will share his introductory remarks for about 20 minutes, and we'll move to Chris and then Ben, who will discuss Philippines and the India respectively for about 15 minutes or so, and we have a lot of time for Q&A. With that, I turn it over to Professor Andrew Rotter. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session, and thank you all for coming. Jay, yeah, I remember well our first meeting. It was great fun talking to you about your work. Your excitement about it was infectious. Oh, not a word I want to use. Contagious. Oh, still not a word. And Chris, who's on record in print as saying this book stinks. Chris, some of you know, blurbed the book, and he said that, and I love that. It's my favorite blurb ever.
I love that I got away with it. So.
And then I'll thank Ben in his absence, and I'll thank him again when he appears, even if in his pajamas. It'll be delightful to meet him. I'm guessing that the audience is a mix of those who've read the book or portions of the book, and those of you who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading the book. So at Jay's suggestion, what I thought I would do is talk for a few minutes about the claims of the book generally, and then let Chris and I hope Ben comment on it, after which I assume we'll open up the session to comments and questions from all of you. This is a book about two empires, British India and the American Philippines, and the ways in which they were created and transacted and ultimately undone by the 5 human senses. Put as gerunds, the senses are seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, feeling, which I combined in something called hapticity, and tasting. The book had its origins in a talk I heard some years ago by a historian named Mark Smith, in which he argued that race, oh, there's Ben, race in the American South was constituted not just by what people thought they saw as difference, that is to say, skin color and physiognomy, but also by alleged differences in how white and black people sounded and smelled, and the supposed texture of their skin, and the kinds of foods they ate. Smith's talk resonated with stories that I'd encountered some years before when I was doing research for the book Jay mentioned, Comrades at Odds, which is a book about the role of culture in US-India relations from 1947 to 1964. I read again and again accounts of, Jay, bless your heart, accounts of travelers, British travelers who would come to India in the early 20th century by ship, and would comment with surprising frequency about how they smelled India before they saw it. So there was some kind of an odor that wafted off the land before they could see the horizon line, or they arrived in the dark, but they knew they were there because they could smell India. And I thought this was interesting. I hadn't thought about it before. I included maybe a paragraph in that book about smell, but didn't think much of it until I heard Smith's talk and the way in which he made the senses come alive as historical actors in his discussion of their part in constituting race in the United States. That got me thinking more broadly about the senses and their role in shaping perceptions of others in imperial places. And I decided it might be fun to compare, or at least juxtapose, two empires in the study. Now, I should say that at the outset, I was considering doing 3. I was considering doing French Indochina, but I decided I'd like to finish the book, and I thought probably it was not a good idea to take on a third area. And the reasons for this particular comparison, comparing British India to the American Philippines, I'm afraid are somewhat prosaic. First of all, I was trying to play to whatever strengths I had as a historian. So I'm trained as a US historian. My feet are really firmly planted in the United States. All of my training was the US and someone else, that kind of old-fashioned style of doing foreign relations history. So I knew something about the origins of US empire in the Philippines. And from the India book, I had learned something about modern India. I was by no means an expert, but I had some idea of kind of the shape of the historiography there. I didn't know much about the British Empire more generally. I knew very little about the history of the Philippines. So I thought if I did this comparison, I would know something about each side of the comparison, and I could learn something else. But that was a major reason why I chose these two cases to compare. The second reason for doing the comparison was kind of a lifelong sense of distress at the provincialism of US-centric foreign relations history. Again, without apology, I can say that I was trained as a US historian. That's okay. But the way of seeing the world solely from the standpoint of the United States, it seemed to me increasingly limited. The other consequence of that was that, as many historians had for years argued, there was a widespread perception that the American empire was profoundly different from other empires, and that it had to be considered in a category of its own, that it came on reluctantly, it ended more quickly, it never took on the kinds of exactions that other empires did. So it was exceptional, as with all of American history. I chafed at that, and I thought by doing a comparison, I could demonstrate that it wasn't so, that empire had a kind of morphology. Thinking here in part about the work of Julian Go, who compares the American and British empires in a way very different from how I do, but inspired by that kind of thinking. And again, by the general distress I felt that so many of my fellow US historians had continued to compartmentalize American empire as something very different from what other empires were. That became a reason for doing this comparison. And so the book has these two photographs on its cover. At the top, you have an American with a dictaphone who is performing for a group of Filipinos, of Igorots, as they were called by the anthropologists, upcountry people, and letting them listen to, in this case, their own voices. He recorded them speaking, and then he played the voices back. And of course, in his account, they were absolutely amazed by the sound of this. And then the photo in the lower portion of the cover, I really like covers, so I'm happy to show it off. Some British guys in pith helmets on elephants. They're attended by the elephant trainers, the mahouts, and a variety of servants. So there you have the comparison, or at least again, the juxtaposition of these two empires. Well, why the senses? What's the point or the value added of approaching empire from the standpoint of the five senses? As I did the work, I developed what I thought of as three premises for the work. I came to think of them as axioms. So convinced was I of their truth. But let me call them here premises. First of all, premise number one, the senses have a history. This was not always obvious, I think, to people, because the senses are, after all, in the first instance, physiological. So for sight, it has to do with the amount of light that comes in through your pupils and then to the optic nerve. For hearing, it has to do with sounds received through the ear as vibrations against bone and fluid and hair cells. Smell has to do with responses to chemical stimuli of the olfactory neurons and so on. But all of these physiological reactions are transmitted to the brain, which means, of course, that they get perceived, interpreted, and reacted to emotionally. That means that the senses are not stable or static. How they work varies over time and across space. We like different smells, different tastes, even the feel of different kinds of air or fabric on our skins. So that's premise number one. The senses have a history. Premise number two, that the senses have much to do with our ideas about civilization. I devote a whole leggy chapter of the book to this issue, the senses and civilization. I was struck in my reading by the powerful associations made between the idea of civilization and respect for the senses. Edmund Burke equated civilization and manners. John Stuart Mill couldn't imagine the first without the second. Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language in 1841 called civilization, in part, quote, the state of being refined in manners from the grossness of savage life. Insofar as empire was about civilizing subjects, and its agents certainly thought that's what they were up to, putting the senses in the right order of priority and protecting them against offense or affront was a critical part of empire building. This was about manners, as Burke and Mill said. Those who were unmannerly, who lacked respect for the senses, that's what manners are, lacked self-control. They were uncivilized, and therefore they were unfit for self-government. People who looked shabby, were noisy or smelly, who felt wrong, who consumed unwholesome food and drink in unmannerly ways, were not prepared to form independent polities or stand on their own. It was the duty of supposedly more civilized, more sensorially advanced Britons and Americans to put the senses right in India and the Philippines before withdrawing the most obvious manifestations of their power. And here is the connection between culture and bodies and sense perception on the one hand, and the politics of governing or power on the other. This is often presented as a dichotomy. There are those of us who are interested in encounters on the ground, in bodies, in culture. And then there are those of us, a majority of my historical organization, the Society for Historian of American Foreign Relations, who are concerned with something else. That something else is power. And that something else has allegedly nothing to do with the first something else, that is to say, culture. I've long struggled with that. I reject that. I think power inheres in culture. And in this book, what I try to say is decisions about governing, decisions about independence for these imperial spaces were predicated on notions of first civilizing the bodies of the people in them. Somatic Orientalism is a way I've heard this described recently, although that's not a term I use directly in the book. I think it's a good one. So that's premise number two. That civilization is about the senses, the refinement of the senses, the correction of them. Final premise, premise number three. All the senses were involved in creating and sustaining, as well as accommodating and resisting empire. Since the Enlightenment, self-described civilizers have tended to rank the senses, with seeing at the top and hearing just below seeing, but with the other closer senses, as they're called, that is smelling and touching and tasting, relegated to the bottom of the sensory hierarchy. Less important, cared for, nurtured, cultivated only by those at the lower end of civilized society. Who were those people? Women who were supposedly very good at sniffing things out, but not very good at seeing things clearly. Class others, especially racial others. These were people who tended to, again, give too much weight to the closer senses and were far less competent at observing the essential civilized niceties of respecting the higher ones. I found all kinds of accounts of revulsion, contempt for others who sniffed people too carefully, sniffed people and objects, who jostled too close in the street with their dangerous, unwashed, and unhealthy bodies, who ate foods that registered as disgusting or were simply overspiced. Bodily encounters in imperial India and the Philippines were thus mediated by all 5 senses. So that's premise number 3. We have to take seriously all 5 senses and understanding how these empires work themselves out. And so we come to the project of empire, the mission of civilization, how to civilize subjects. Well, the answer was to create for them, to really impose on them, a new sensory regime, new bodily disciplines. Find them and count them and photograph them. Bring them out of hiding. Eliminate their various visual deceptions. Get them, moving to hearing, get them to quiet down. These places were so loud, the British and Americans complained. And then teach some of them, at least, to speak passable English so as to reveal their plans, so you could know what they were up to. Channel their stinking wastes into latrines and sewers. Scrub and soften and lighten their skins and inoculate or vaccinate them so that contact with them, touch with them, might prove less harmful. And persuade them to eat and drink less dangerous foods and beverages in more hygienic ways. Then, and only then, could you declare them sufficiently self-controlled to entertain the possibility of their self-government. Now, 2 more quick, somewhat related points, and I'll stop. The efforts at sensory revision, the efforts at civilization, began at home. They began in Victorian Britain, in progressive America. These were efforts to refine the places and bodies of the lower classes. Hector Gavin surveyed Bethnal Green in London at mid-century. Jacob Riis was drawn to New York's Lower East Side in the first place by its odors. Empires of the senses thus developed from the inside out, as it were, with urban underclasses that became projects undertaken for the presumed benefit of imperial subjects. So what you discovered, what you were able to do, how you were able to revise and reform underclasses at home could be transferred to the so-called periphery, to the empires. And final point, these projects, shaped by encounters between the agents of empire and their subjects, then bounced back to Britain and the United States, to London and New York City. Sensory regimes, it turned out, could not be fully and successfully imposed. Instead, they were modified and hybridized by their encounters. I think this was more fully true of Great Britain than the United States. We can talk about this if you like and talk about reasons why it might be true. But we know, for example, and I'll finish here, that many of the British Nawabs, civil servants, officials, soldiers, returned home to Britain, sometimes bringing their servants and especially their cooks along with them. Taste, as it turned out, was the most malleable sense. as the British affection for Indian food to this day attests. Let me stop there and let Chris and Ben have at it.
Jay, do you have a sense of which of us should go first?
I just told Ben that as I introduced everyone, I had said you will go next because he was on his way. So if that's fine with you, we can just stick to that, or we can go by what the sequence in the title, which India comes first. So it's entirely up to you and Ben.
Chris, I'm good for either. You let me know.
I'll dive in, and we'll go with why not? So thanks to Jay for inviting me to be part of this, and of course thanks to Andy Rotter for writing this book and giving it to to the profession, to multiple historiographies, as a gift for contemplation and for inspiration. So I want to talk a little bit about both of those, like what we get from it, and then where we go from it after this point. And so I'm just going to make a couple of, a few minutes of comments, and there are some questions in here along the way. These are sort of questions partly for Andy and partly for sort of collective discussion, so just to get the conversation started. And I am coming to this, as people know, as someone also trained very much in U.S. history, but as someone who also works extensively in the Philippines, and sort of and rather less so with literatures on India and South Asia. But for me, first of all, the most valuable thing, Andy, that you have done here is to simply to write all this down. That you have clearly assembled an enormous archive, either on your computer or in your head, that draws from hundreds of memoirs and thousands of letters and tons of photographs and other kinds of accounts that have never been put together in this way, right? That it is the compilation and I think curation of an archive of the colonial sensorium is a crucial recovery project, and I think that that needs to be sort of, we have to start there, right, with that enterprise. And certainly in the history of the Philippines, this is really crucial work in a place where the historiography has been dominated for a century in many ways by political and military affairs, and in which sort of history of everyday life, of society, and of cultural history are just not sufficiently part of the conversation, in part because that archive needs to be constructed, right? So that is really, really crucial, and thank you for that. And also, another achievement is the project of putting these two empires next to each other, right, in a juxtaposition, as you call it, that I think maybe might have begun as a comparison and turned into a trans-imperial history of connection. And maybe you can reflect on whether I got that sort of arrow right or not. But I think that, as you read it, you start to see the linkages between the two, rather than sort of the two operating in a social scientific sense as case studies in the testing of the hypothesis. And I think that that's also really crucial for breaking down national frames of analysis that, in still decades after sort of area studies and models continue to kind of dominate, right? That, there are too many Americans writing about the Philippines and too many British people writing about India, and still to this day, right? And we need to sort of put these fields very much more in dialogue. Mostly, I want to talk about empire, right? Empire as a social form, and social in the sense, not as some of our flat-footed colleagues at Schaeffer might say, as distinct from the political, right? But social as the terrain on which the political operates as a superstructural form. Right? And so I fear for you, Andy, that the worst thing that will happen to you with this book is that it will be cited by scholars who want to say, oh, well, and culture also matters, see, comma, Rotter, comma, empire of the senses. With no pages actually cited, appended there too, because of course the people have not actually read it, right? They just heard you tell some, you know, and all they remember are the good stories about William Howard Taft and his underwear, right? So, so what do we need to do to ensure that this terrible outcome does not come to pass, right? And I think that what we need to do is what you have sort of said, right? That there is no history of empire that is not also always a history of culture, right? That is also a history, in particular, of the relationship of the senses. And in particular, because formulations of power and hierarchies of power were never structured without a reference to civilization, and civilization was never understood without reference to the senses, right? And I think that that's, you know, sort of that there's no sort of, it's no extra, it's no add-on, it is sort of that fundamental part of the enterprise. And I think that the way in which the book also contributes to thinking about civilization as a concept is also really new and important, right? The people obviously know that this is a powerful keyword for sort of the history of the world in the turn of the century, and empire as a form. And they've tended to approach it through sort of textual analysis of the word civilization, through kind of literary analysis, through intellectual histories, often turning to sort of proto-race science notions of civilization. And I think you begin with the bodily encounter in ways that really sort of shakes up that approach. I think also that is in some ways the move you're making in thinking about the history of empire. Right, and asking us to move from understanding this as a process that seeks to deprive a subject people of sovereignty over territory to one that aims at the categorization and hierarchization of bodies in space, right? And so if we think of empire as not territory, as a contest over territory, but as a contest over the body, then I think we start to see it in new ways, right? This, of course, raises questions about sort of what, you know, sort of where this empire is if we give up the question of territory, right? So it's less a question of sort of which parts of the map are colored in, you know, sort of pink to represent the British Empire, right? And more a sort of question of what kinds of relations of bodies are at space, are at work, regardless of where the territory is, right? And so you mentioned in your talk just now, right, that this begins in the metropole, right? And you write about it in the book as well. And, you know, you can, maybe I'd love to hear even more about how you see this projection that you describe, you know, this move from the inside out working as you move from, say, Chinatown and the Lower East Side, or, you know, even sort of non-urban spaces like Native American reservations, the sort of famine cottages of rural Ireland, right? How do these kinds of sort of uncivilized spaces in the metropole actually function as models for the civilization of colonized spaces that are territorially distinct from the metropole itself? All right, and then a question is about where the history of the senses as forms that change over time intersects with the history of empire as a form that changes over time, right? So, so in that sense, there, you know, it's to me, I was wondering as I was reading this, is this actually, does it aim at a history of empire, or does empire just simply happen to be the dominant form of global political organization during the phase in the history of the senses to which this book is primarily addressed. Right? So sort of a moment in the history of the senses about modernity, about particular ways of vision, particular ways of understanding the sonic before widespread recorded sound, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a moment that you see as sort of as kind of an inflection point in the history of the senses, also happens to coincide with a moment at which territory is organized around the form of the empire, right? Or is it that you're after empire and senses is a good path into it, right? So sort of basically like opening up the hood of the book, trying to figure out how the motor runs here, right? So just to make, to turn that into a question, would a book called Democracies of the Senses read any differently? Right? Would it be written any differently? Would a book called Nation States of the Senses be different, and in, both in terms of its archive and in terms of its methods? Another way of thinking about this is to shift the chronology, right? So I found myself wondering how reading this book would help me understand the 21st century US empire, right? A world of biometric surveillance, sonic torture at Guantanamo Bay, bomb sniffing dogs at the border, the call to prayer that no Iraq movie can be without, and of course of drone warfare, in which the haptic experience consists of gripping a joystick in a bunker in Nebraska and never touching the body of the enemy. Now I think that you would ask us to begin with those bodily encounters, right? But if we do that in 2020 instead of 1920, what's the same and what's different? And then one last question, specific to the context of a global decolonization seminar, is to ask what it would mean to decolonize the empires of the senses. And I think you get at this in your last chapter, and wonder if maybe, so I'll just push you here and say maybe there's not enough in your chapter on decolonization. And you can think of sort of multiple ways in which the empire of the senses could be resisted, right? One would be a very James C. Scott sort of approach of sort of tracking, like, who are the people who are, who are resisting, who are continuing to smell, who are disrupting the empire by smelling and shouting and all the rest. Or you could do a sort of Ann Stoler sort of approach and sort of imagine, like, track where the anxieties of the colonizers about their own civilization. And I think you sort of do that over the course of the book. I think what you turn to in the chapter and in your writings on food as well, you write really touchingly about the transformative power of the intimacy of eating. But there's, I think, an implicit sense there that more cosmopolitanism is better, right? That culinary cosmopolitanism is a sort of is a step toward a decolonization, and I'm wondering if maybe that is maybe a little too hopeful, right? In a writing, right? So as Henry Yu famously put it in the 2003 essay in the American Historical Review, right? Tiger Woods is not the end of history, right? And in that sense, sort of Indian food in Britain will not save us, right? And I would end actually in some ways, if we ended the book with the proliferation of Jollibee restaurants in the Middle East, right? In Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and also briefly in Iraq, where this Filipino fast food chain serves comfort food to contract workers recruited as part of the Philippines' contribution to the Coalition of the Willing. Right? Here we see a very different kind of sort of history of sort of crossings of culture and food that I think makes us see that empire persists in new ways in the 21st century. And just sort of wondering if you could give us as a guide to beginning the exploration of that as rich and as powerful as the one you gave us to understanding the turn of the century empires you write about here. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Jay, do you want to have Ben go next?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's best that
And then I'll
Ben goes next, and then you respond, and I could
Good.
collect some questions from the audience in the meantime. I think that
Great.
that could work. Okay.
Great.
Yeah, Chris, that's a tough act to follow. My apologies for showing up late. That was 50% technical glitch and 50% central nervous system glitch and about 100% 2020 behavior. So thanks for bearing with me. And thanks, Jay, and the Global Decolonization Initiative for the opportunity to say a couple of words about this just astonishingly evocative book. It came out well before our particular epidemiological moment, but reading it has been a real rare pleasure in a year that has not given too many of them. One of the treats of reading Empires of the Senses is that it's actually a sensuous experience. Much of the book's core explorations are around questions of violence and power and domination, but like the best fiction, its writing very frequently transports us and vividly to the material experiences of imperialism in India and the Philippines. And I think Chris said this really nicely, that merely the act of putting this all together and creating a textual record would have been work enough, but it goes much beyond this. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but just some brief contextualization. Andy Rauter, of course, is one of our field's great comparativists. He's someone whose scholarship first always makes you feel pretty inadequate for not pressing as far into the archives or the ideas as he has. And then after you've recovered, inspires you to push your own work a little bit wider and further. And I'm comforted to know and to hear that introduction that the book has been a long time coming. Its genesis was that provocation that came in the pages of Diplomatic History about 10 years ago, which put together the experiences of Britons in India and Americans in the Philippines for the first time. And Andy, I don't know if you mentioned this beforehand, but of course you were exploring the intersection of optics and empire well before that. In your review essay on Saidism Without Said, which was published in 2000 in the AHR, presages many of the questions that Empires of the Senses takes on in earnest. Not peace and perhaps comrades at odds hints at, I think, that notion of somatic Orientalism mentioned earlier, maybe about 20 years before that particular term. So Andy Rauter's undertaken this comparative effort to resounding effect, and I can't really imagine a student of imperialism or the colonial world, or hopefully a student of diplomatic history, who undertaking her work without first taking in the lessons of Empires of the Senses. It's a book that, for its focus on the epistemic and material violence done in the name of perception, brings alive many of the sensory experiences of markets and meals, of flesh, roads and dust, clubs and private homes, and the smells, sights, touches, and taste which constituted, in a literal sense, these empires. And it's a reminder, like so much of your work, that culture, and maybe even, as you mentioned, physiology as it's translated and remade into culture, is never epiphenomenal to the making of power, but really constitutive of it. So this is a project with very little precedent. South Asianists have produced a rich scholarship on the visual idioms of empire, and they've generally focused on questions of photography and cartographic knowledge in the late 19th century. And I see a few art historians here, and that's a field that's been really instrumental in bringing those questions forward. And to a lesser extent, scholars like Parama Roy or Lizzie Collingham have foregrounded some of the elementary forms or the gustatory forms of empire making and empire contesting. And there's a few post-colonial historians of South Asia who are now considering sound and its circulations in particularly newly independent India and Pakistan. But Empires of the Senses represents a much larger and more encompassing project, where James Scott and many scholars of imperial knowledge have asked us to see like colonial states. Andy Rauter instead urges us to remember that the entire human sensorium was engaged in the acts of making and accommodating and resisting empire. And departing from more familiar terrain, so the placemaking of colonial violence and the efforts of Americans and Britons to make their subjects visible, legible, and visually respectable, he asks us to then bring in the rest of that sensorium. So what did colonial administrators hear in their new spaces of empire? And how did they work to make their subjects quiet down or speak in respectable English or turn untrammeled noise into dulcet sound instead? Likewise, smell is cast as this civilizing infrastructure of the colonial project, and it frames the putrefaction that imperialists saw in India and China as this dispositive odor of unpacified lands. The book also offers us this notion of haptic imperialism, not merely the notion that colonial lands and people were to be held and grasped and gripped, but that skin itself, perceptive, thin and coarse, dark or light, clear or diseased, was this determinative membrane by which civilization itself could be marked. And then he turns his attention to the gustatory experiences of empire, locating us in the changing registers of anxiety, which surrounded the eating of a mango or a pineapple or a meal of rice, or imperial fears of what lurked inside a native kitchen. Empires of the Senses ends with a postscript outlining how the sensory landscapes of India and the Philippines had been, in fact, actually transformed by empire. And that's a subject that I want to return to in just a minute. But I want to add first that Empire of the Senses, I think, is the first book which brings to the imperial world a set of concerns around bodily experience and governance that mostly has been the domain of early modern historians instead. And so I'm thinking here of work like Rebecca Earle's studies of foodways and bodies in colonial Spanish America, or David Abulafia's account of senses in Atlantic encounters, or even David Barnes' accounts of smell and disease in 19th century France. It's a little bit later. And so that itself is a really just major intervention for us. As a historian who's worked on food and famines, I'm gonna have to really restrain myself from not digging into that one deeper. So if there's time, I wanna come back to that later. And I also have a question that I wanna ask if there is time about the intersections of emotion as opposed to feeling, because I think that's something that is in the background of the book, and maybe there will be time to come back to that later. But I wanna focus my question here broadly on the afterlives of sense in the post-colonial world. And more specifically, I wanna talk briefly about eating rats. And if that phrase or that idea called up something strong inside you, like a sense of revulsion, I'd also refer you to the second chapter of this book on the colonial origins of politeness and taste and distinction, which Andy underplayed earlier, and it's just a really superlative primer that stands incredibly by itself. But let me offer a little bit of context about that idea of eating rats. About 20 years ago, the Bihari politician Lalu Prasad Yadav, who was one of India's most formidable populists of the pre-Narendra Modi era, began speaking pretty constantly with reporters about the merits of rat eating. Lalu is a physically imposing politician. He's now in the late stages of kidney failure, and his career has been marked by controversy, corruption, and stints alternately between prison and government. And at this moment, again, around the turn of the millennia, he seemed to take great delight in regaling English and proper Hindi-speaking reporters about how the best ways to catch and prepare a rat. He recalled how as a child he learned to trap those animals, pulling off inedible skin, and then marinating them afterwards in green chilies and salt. And after you could roast them, you could put a coal in their abdomens, and the result, Lalu always used to say, was delicious. And the important thing, of course, was to avoid female rats because they might be pregnant, and that was kind of gastronomically inferior. And I'll read that as Lalu making a case for his own gustatory discernment. So Lalu made his career as a populist of the rat-eating vein. And it telegraphed to politicians in Delhi who had to contend with him just how far he had been raised from the capital's imperial boulevards and air-conditioned ministries. And this conceit wasn't always conveyed in such a deliberately unappetizing manner. Lalu's self-projection was that of a rustic, and he conveyed it to his constituents, to Delhi politicians, and national reporters in what I now realize are haptic and olfactory and gustatory terms. He was born into a family of cowherds. He would always recall the sensory experiences of leashing cattle as a boy, of blackening logs for slate and that smell, and of deceiving urban customers who believed that fresh milk's barnyard tinge was a defect. He'd dilute it with water and then trick officers and merchants into believing that it was the real thing. And I want to ask Chris if we could read Rodrigo Duarte in the Philippines as kind of a similar or a parallel, a politician operating in kind of parallel lines. And so Lalu also remained attentive to the haptic mystique or the sensory mystique of governance throughout his entire career. And at the risk of a very boring personal aside, when I went to India for the first time as an 18-year-old, I was on a train ride through Bihar, and I had a cup of tea that was served in a really rustic, but what I thought was kind of a beautiful, small, unfinished clay cup, and was meant to be jettisoned and thrown out on the railway tracks afterwards. And it was only afterwards that a friend explained to me that these cups were the norm in Lalu's province of Bihar, where he had legislated their use in place of plastic to keep pot throwers employed. And it was only while reading this book that I realized that the haptic qualities of that cup might have actually been just as important or as constitutive of a gesture. But Lalu, I don't think, was the first politician who laid claims to an alternate sensory reading of India. India's Anglophone elite were the inheritors, or maybe the custodians, of the haptic and olfactory and visual and gustatory idioms of empire. I think it wasn't for nothing that Nehru described himself as the last Englishman to rule India, his Congress cap and his vest and his Sherwani and rose notwithstanding. And anyone who spent time in rarefied Delhi spaces in particular, in the golf club, in the India International Center, the press club, even a Connaught Place arcade, or who spent a weekend in Shimla or another hill station in India, will recognize that that aesthetic legacy isn't wholly dead. And I think India's passive revolution and the sensory forms of that passive revolution are encapsulated really neatly in those spaces. But since the 50s, there have been also alternate, what I now think are sensory readings of India that politicians have leveraged or deployed in service of different visions of governance and political life. Towards the end of the 1950s, urban free marketers made common cause with landed farmers and the ascendant Hindu right to advocate for the allegedly intertwined interests of all three. And that project failed, but maybe in part because the sensory worlds of those groups meshed poorly with one another. Much more successful was the first encroach of India's lower castes and rural politicians into Delhi in the 1980s with the rise of the New Farmers Movement, which cast divergent political ends in sensorial terms. One of the most powerful leaders of that movement, Sharad Joshi, who's now mostly been forgotten, cast urban India against rural Bharat in this kind of sensory idiom. He said in a 1981 speech that Indian children take Ovaltine and toast for breakfast, they don uniforms and they go to costly schools for an Indian education, whereas the children of Bharat munch a morsel of stale bakri like a rustic flatbread. They kill their hunger with a mug full of water, they pick up a stick and go out to tend animals. I think the ends of Narendra Modi's Hindu majoritarian project have been starkly different from this, but he too has known the value of the bodily and the sensorial, from rustic descriptions of selling tea as a child to his demonstrative performance of yoga asanas and hilltop cave meditation to this new quarantine beard that he's grown meant to evoke the saintly idiom of Indian politics. It's a really awful beard, as an aside. I think there's this frisson even beyond the sensorial accounts of urban India's colonial legacy and rural Bharat unbound. Even now, as we talk, the largest strike in human history is occurring in India, with farmers protesting against an agricultural bill that would deal an even greater set of blows to the agricultural sector than it's experienced over the last several decades. But a sensorial reading of that strike offers immense new analytic possibilities. Simply the marshaling of human bodies, of noise, heat, smell, crowds against the backdrop of a pandemic is worth considering against that longer imperial drive for order, visibility, and sedentary productivity. But I think there's also other possibilities at work. The Indian media and Indian Twitter has zeroed in over the last couple of weeks on the emergence of what they're calling pizza langars in the protest. And traditionally, a langar is a Sikh or a Punjabi public feeding kitchen, and it offers free meals to anyone who comes. But the langar, which serves usually chapati and rice and dal, is ill-suited to big, massive assemblies of this size. And farmers have been setting up langars serving Indianified pizzas, which have the advantage of being mobile and traveling quickly through crowds. And urban right-wingers have responded with umbrage, declaring that farmers' embrace of pizza negates their claims to a kind of rustic authenticity. But as one farmer tweeted this week, taking us maybe a little bit full circle, no one cared when the farmers were forced to eat rats, but all hell breaks loose when they start to eat pizza. So let me leave this as kind of an open-ended question for our group. And I think this resonates with what Chris was asking, at least partially. How do we trace the afterlives of the sensorial project of imperialism into this post-colonial context, where the lines of civilization and the uncivilized fray and braid in along different political affinities? And what would it mean to do these kind of post-imperial histories of the senses, or to imbue our histories of political economy in the 20th century or the 21st century with this kind of new attentiveness towards the human sensorium? And again, I think that's the same question that Chris was asking earlier about what the book called Democracies of the Senses would look like and what it would do, or what the sensory history of the 21st century may begin to look like. I'll save those other questions for later if we have time, but I'll just leave us by saying how much I think Empires of the Senses gives us just such a new impetus to take on these questions and put them in our own work. So again, thank you for this, and I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben and Chris. Andy, back to you to respond to what Chris and Ben said. And to all the audience, if you have questions, please raise your blue hand and I'll call on you. And if you would like to not be recorded, just write and I'll also read out your questions.
Great, thank you. What a wonderful pair of comments. Extraordinarily generous, combined with such excellent questions, most of which I haven't thought of or have no idea how to answer, but they're just a wonderful way to keep thinking about these themes for all of us. But let me try a few of them. And let me start with what Chris said about the service of writing this all down. I did have the sense of writing a lot down when I did the book, and a struggle with myself and with my editor, having to do with what goes in and what gets cut. A lot of stuff got cut, but a whole lot of stuff got in, and the critical review of the book so far, the one I've seen, and took most to heart, was one that said, yeah, it's a lot. It is a lot. I had the sense in doing it, and in making these arguments to my editor, the sense that because it all felt pretty new, I wanted to just err on the side of inclusion. Which is a very self-indulgent way to think, and yet one that I think corresponds to what Chris and Ben said, that this is just not something that people have thought about before. This hasn't been done before, and therefore, on the one hand, I wanted to put as many examples in as I could, in order to say, yes, this is a real thing. Please believe me, it's true that this matters. I think all of us. It's kind of an undergraduate tick, but all of us have that tendency to, include as much as possible in order to demonstrate beyond any shadow of a doubt that what we're saying is right. So it does feel that way, at least in terms of kind of evidentiary load. But at the same time, and perhaps paradoxically, it leaves off, and both of you adverted to this, with a full consideration of what came at the end. The last chapter, as Chris says, is a little thin. It doesn't go into the post-colonial, as both of you pointed out. That was done partly because I felt the need of a narrative arc, and I always feel that need when I write. But I felt it especially here because of the woolly nature of the subject, and again, my tick toward inclusiveness. I wanted to come to a finish, and all finishes, like all beginnings, I suppose, are arbitrary. I had to just kind of close my eyes and point to a spot where I would finish, and so that's where I finished. Again, conscious that I'd loaded the reader with so many examples that the reader's patience was probably exhausted at that point. So that explains the relatively slim conclusion. And not just its slimness, but its contrived neatness. It does feel a little too neat to say, Ben, I think you said that this was kind of a success, that the regime of the census changed in these places, that those who were in charge of changing the censorate regime could pronounce themselves satisfied that things had taken place that they wished to have take place, and that these people, the Indians and the Filipinos, were now sufficiently capable of governing themselves. For those who haven't read that last chapter, it begins with a kind of confession, which is to say, look, I know that empire didn't end because the Americans in the Philippines and the British in India said, oh, well, now they all eat with forks and knives, and most of them use toilets, and some of them speak English, and they're no longer deceiving us optically. They're no longer hiding from us. We have revealed them. We have counted them, all the ways in which they tried to change these censory regimes. There were lots of really good reasons that have nothing to do with the census to explain the timing of the departures of the US in 1946 and the British in 1947. Something else I say is that these were not complete departures. And this goes on, and presumably the connections that Britain has to India and the Americans have to the Philippines continues to produce all kinds of interesting sensory negotiations. But what you're both asking me to do, and it's absolutely valid, is somewhat beyond my ken. Chris, I love the examples of the drug sniffing dogs, the drones, which gives you the visual without the tactile. Although in a way, it's the remoteness of the tactility of it, the ability to mete out death without directly seeing the people you're killing, much less feeling their bodies. It's the distancing, the distressing distancing allowed by a joystick that gives this a kind of a nightmarish quality, if we're speaking in tactile terms. My mind will come back to some of this, I hope, but we'll see. So, Chris, the question about whether this was a history of empire in search of the senses, that is, whether I decided to work on empire and decided, oh, the senses might be a good way to look at this, or whether there's something about changes in the way we thought about the senses, which predicted the timing here, which created points of intersection between the history of the census and the history of empire, is a really good one. I do think that, and I refer to this very briefly in the book, that there are shifts, important shifts in the way we're thinking about the census in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And again, we're talking in awfully broad terms here. We do that when we talk about bodies, the senses, we talk about culture. We can't help but to condense in ways that are distressing to people with any respect for empirical truth. But I do that, and that's just sort of the way I think about history. But I do think that the importance of vision has risen in the late 19th century with the rise of photography, the spread of photography. Everybody's taking pictures. The rise of literacy contributes to this as well. So what is seen, I think, becomes more important just at the moment that these empires are taking place. Hearing is there too. This is the period, after all, of the gramophone. This is the period in which sound can be distributed, radio. All that. I was surprised at the number of Indian households that apparently had radios supplied by the British by the late 1920s, insofar as they had electricity, or one guy in the village had electricity. They could all listen to the radio and listen to the BBC and whatever the BBC had for them. So I think those two senses do emerge at this time. And in trying to map the book, I went back and forth on the organization of the book. And in the end, I decided that this was a kind of, perhaps vague, but nevertheless compromise between the change over time argument and the thematic argument for organization, which is to say, I begin with seeing as the sense the British and Americans, the builders of empire, believed was most important at the time. So post Great Rebellion in India and post so-called insurrection in the Philippines, they had to establish first their sense of sight, and they had to first convince people in the Philippines not to hide from them and shoot at them, and people in India not to play tricks on them, as they accused the Indians constantly of doing. They had to count them. They had to create these censuses. Paul Kramer talks about this really well with respect to the Philippines, and I think it's true in India too. You've got to count people in order to manage them, and this is the whole James Scott thing. And what comes after that is hearing. So the first two chapters after that chapter on civilization that Ben mentioned were seeing and hearing, and then I cluster the other three together, and I say I'm doing that these are the close senses. Those are to some extent interchangeable. But so all of that is a kind of a long-winded and ham-fisted way of saying, yes, Chris, I think there is something that works in tandem, temporally in tandem, between the way the senses are understood, at least in the US and in Britain, and the arrival of these people in empire. So these things coincide. It's circumstantial, accidental, but it is the case. Let's see. Yeah, is the kind of cosmopolitanism one finds with the British affection for Indian food, for example, any better? Does it change anything fundamentally, substantially? No, and I think the examples you gave of the continuation of contest over the senses and sensory empire is evidence of that. Beyond that, I'm not sure what to say, but I'd welcome more discussion of this in the group. It's the coward's way out. Ben, I love the story of Lala Yadav and eating rats, and the kind of instrumentalizing of that to turn to populism and the other sensory examples you gave. Modi's beard actually, I think, might be a good example of the senses and the signifier that a beard is anyway is something that someone should surely explore. Why does the beard look the way it does? I'm not sure I agree with you, by the way, that it's a bad beard. I think the contrast of the gray and the skin color is really quite striking. And I should say that my father-in-law has a very similar beard, although I've been quiet about it looking like Modi's beard. But yeah, I will say more about that. I'm reminded of, you didn't mention Morarji Desai. Most Americans who know anything about Morarji Desai know one thing about him, which is that he allegedly drank his urine. And that was, of course, a post-independence thing, but it seemed to reinforce, I think, for many Americans that Indians had not fully learned the habits of good behavior. He turned it into kind of a spiritual thing. I don't know if this is true of Lalu as well for eating rats, but this is why we drink urine. But that same sense of revulsion exists, and I think many Americans continue to feel that way about India. That India is a dirty place. It's a fascinating place, and this goes finally to the last thing I'll just mention, and then we'll get on to other people's questions. I didn't say in my introductory remarks, but I try to say throughout the book what you mentioned, and that is that these were empires of anxiety, that when you put yourself down in these places, you're nervous about it. So whatever kind of power you have or you think you have, whatever kind of swagger you bring to it, whatever kind of brutality you exert, as the British did in India and the Americans in the Philippines, that nevertheless doesn't change the powerful sense that these were people who knew themselves to be outnumbered in hazardous places for their bodies, that their bodies were under threat in their view. Every day they walked outside, and so much of their desire to alter the sensorium of these places was based on fear for penetrations of their body by disease, by something sharp in the street, or simply by visual or oral offense. Bodies in hazardous places is the idea I kept coming back to. I kept encountering as I looked at the evidence here. So that's kind of a pastiche of answers to some really great questions. And I'd welcome follow-up, or as I say, questions from others.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. We have Mark Gilbert next, and then Brew Flower after him. Mark. Mark, you're muted. You're still muted.
I got it. How about now? Yeah, great. It's great to see Andy again. We worked on a book on Vietnam a very long time ago, but it's still in print. A couple of things. One is that the enormous gap that exists between scholars of international studies, diplomatic history, and military history, and world historians. World historians have been living in this space for a very long time, along with many more Indian South Asian historians. The cultures of colonialism are of fundamental understanding in terms of reversing also the colonial gaze. Not talking so much about how the colonizer looked at the colonized, but how the colonized looked at the colonizer. So in some senses, there are scholars working deeper in other levels. Right now, I'm looking at the response of Filipinos to Indian merchants at the beginning of the last century on how they perceived each other. And I think what Andy has done is created a touchstone for all of those kinds of perceptions and study. And I think that's great. But I think we have a long way to go before diplomatic historians, at least anyway, even though they understand a thing now called cultural diplomacy, realize the actual depth that Andy has brought to this particular study. So if there is a question, because I found in all dialogue between academics, all the questions are actually comments, I'll try to ask Andy a question. What is the one thing that you would like to go from here with? That is, you've written this great book, a seminal book. Would you be carrying this on into a future study? And that's my question.
Thanks, Mark. Jay, should I go ahead and answer that? Yeah, great. Good to see you. Just, yeah, a couple of quick comments. As you said, a long way to go before diplomatic historians sort of get this. Maybe. I'd like to think it's changing. I think the book is perplexing to a lot of the people I kind of came up with, who are very nice in a general way, but I think don't quite see how to fit this into their categories, which is okay. I've always decided that, always thought that being, provocative was in some ways even more exciting than being right. Someone who accuses me of making a mistake doesn't bother me. If someone says it's sort of boring, that hurts. But no one said that, really. So that's good. I would like to think, Mark, that the field, our fellow members of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations have changed quite a bit, and I think they're more open than they might have been previously to cultural interpretations. But that leads me to my response to your question, which is, what do I do next? Part of provocation is to create the provocation, and then a real provocateur moves on. and leaves others to argue. And if they're interested, sort of pick up any insights they can and try them for themselves. And so that's kind of my feeling with this. But in fact, that's really kind of an obnoxious answer. Let me give you a better one. The project I'm working on now, and I confess I've struggled with it for various reasons. I think, as we've all struggled this year, to concentrate on anything but that which is right in front of us. I've certainly felt that. And but I'm supposedly writing a primer on culture and U.S. foreign relations history. So many years ago, Michael Hunt wrote a really great and famous book called Ideology in U.S. Foreign Policy. I'd like to do for culture what Hunt did for ideology. And culture, obviously, for me, encompasses this kind of work. It has to do with the body and the senses. It isn't all of it. Culture is wonderful and frustrating because it is so expansive. It fills every crack available to it in the basin of thinking about foreign relations history, to paraphrase George Kennan. But so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm struggling with a way to say it without allowing it to kind of sprawl all over the place. But that's my way of, I hope, Mark, capturing the last generation of new thinking about U.S. foreign relations history that will include, but not be completely absorbed by, my work on the senses. It'll go back in some respects to what I said about U.S.-India relations and that piece that Ben so kindly recalled on Edward Said. That's like 2 decades ago, but I'm still thinking in those ways, and I would like to collect those thoughts. So that's the next project.
Great. Thanks so much, Andy. We have Brooke Flower next. Brooke, are you still asking the question?
If there are others who want to ask questions, you can skip over me.
No, you are next.
Okay. I've got like a bunch of different thoughts. I found this so stimulating. And I mean, I know I'm just sitting here at my house in quarantine, so that doesn't say a lot, but the comments from Chris and Ben and Andy, your work is just such a wonderful thing to see all this mixed together. One thing I was thinking about when, this question about like a sensory regime and what happens with decolonization. I find this a really interesting question. You mentioned the rise of certain kinds of visual and audio, sensory experiences with the rise of the gramophone, the radio, and so forth, and photography. I think there's even more you could talk about with smelling and feeling. If you think about the evolving understanding about disease and how disease is spread, and the decline of thinking about miasmas, and the rise in understanding about epidemiological knowledge that happens in the late 19th century. It coincides perfectly also with your story. And I'm thinking about feeling, and this is something that goes to Ben's work on the history of pain, and how pain moves from something that is necessary and that you bear it, and it's, and you just deal with it, to something that you can conquer and that shouldn't be there and should be overcome. And so it seems like there's something really radical shifting in the late 19th century, not only with visual and audio experience, but also with feeling and smelling. And I'm sure we could figure out a way to throw taste in there too. But what's interesting is how the decolonization moment doesn't have a similar shift or any sort of radical break in these sensory, in the sensory regime. And so it's interesting to me that shift helps to explain the rise of sort of high empire, this very rich moment of imperial power making that you've charted in your book, but we can't somehow make it do the same kind of work to explain decolonization. And that's just sort of fascinating to me. I don't know what to make of that, but I find that really interesting. But my question for you actually is about being a provocateur, and this may lead to an invitation for me down the road to be on an OAH panel, so I can maybe draft you into that. And it has to do with William Howard Taft's Underpants too. What is the purpose of grossing out your readers? You said you want to be a provocateur, and your work really is a kind of visceral experience for readers. And one thing that I'm wrestling with in my own work is the role of, really evocative passages on things that can be very unsettling or disturbing. And this could extend to, how we depict violence in our histories, or how we depict, disgusting things, or how we depict, say, sexual assault. It seems to me there's a really complicated morality that we have to work through in wrestling with when and how we really try to unsettle our readers, and whether we're doing that in a way that's just kind of salacious, or whether there's a way to sort of argue for that kind of work as important for the reader to sort of get outside themselves into another world. And that's something that I don't know enough about. So anyway, Sarah Snyder and I want to do a panel on this. So you might see an invitation from us about that coming down the road.
Thanks, Brooke. I'd accept that invitation. I think that'd be a lot of fun. So to your first point, yeah, I did mention it in response to Chris and Ben, but it is absolutely the case that things change with regard to the other senses in the late 19th century as well, and what you say about the shift to germ theory, which comes, to my surprise, less kind of completely and immediately as you might suppose, that these discoveries are made. They seem absolutely solid, Pasteur and Cook and Haffkine and all of them figure out that bacteria cause many of these problems, and you can solve these problems by not drinking tainted water. Or there are vaccinations or inoculations you can give for various kinds of diseases that are common in tropical areas. And the first thing to do is persuade people that this is okay to do. And a lot of that has to do with touch. Who does the vaccinating? Who does the inoculating? Do they trust, think about current debates, do they trust, white men who don't speak their language, who don't come from their place, who don't know their lives, to give them a fairly sizable shot? And when I say a shot, I don't mean a little disposable syringe with a small needle. I mean, in many cases, the kind of treatment that even the British, one of the guys doing it, admitted was rather heroic, as he put it. The kinds of gouging of the skin that had to take place to introduce the variola, whatever it was, against whatever disease. They were all slightly different, but this had to take place. So there's a lot of conflict in the area of touch, and people would run away rather than get vaccinated. So, the British and the Americans understood that this was true, and the Americans, I think, in many ways, following the British in this, moved to use so-called native nurses or doctors to do the actual vaccinating, figuring that they would inspire more trust. This was further complicated by caste issues in India, not quite so serious in the Philippines, but there's that. As for smell, you mentioned miasma. They do understand on a certain level that smell doesn't create disease by the late 19th century, and yet it's very difficult for them to get to that place, to say for sure that that's true. The earlier belief was the miasma itself, and that is the odor associated with miasma, actually created the illness. They now say, well, that's not true, perhaps that's not true, but if you smell that bad smell, you are still likely to get sick, that the smell is associated with the disease, even if it doesn't cause it. So that doesn't go away altogether. But to some extent, the British and Americans say, look, people who are still so backward as to imagine that smell is important really need to change their way of thinking. So you're right, Brooke, and thanks for that the sensory regime or the sensory episteme, or whatever big word we want to give it, changes in other ways as well. As hearing and seeing become more important, some of these other senses become more debased in the eyes of Westerners. The purpose of grossing out your reader, I guess I would make a distinction, that's such a wonderful way to put it, between grossing out my reader and voyeurism. Maybe not. I mean, I hadn't thought about it this way before, but maybe what you're suggesting is that when I'm writing about bad smells or the gouging of the body, I'm talking about disgust. But when you're talking about rape, when you're talking about race stuff, violence, then that crosses other lines for me. That does seem to me something different, more sensitive, more problematic. I have a friend who teaches in Canada who is a Native American historian, and he started a book on the Green River killings some years ago, and got some court records that people hadn't seen before, and some very powerful testimony about this. This is a guy who was killing women, many Native American women, and got away with it for years and years and years. And he said at some point in his work, he had to stop. He couldn't do it anymore because it was, in his view, inherently exploitive to go on, even to depict in the most, sympathetic ways, in the most outraged ways, the vulnerability of these women, the killing of these women was itself beyond the moral pale, beyond his capacity as a historian. And I took that on. I mean, I've done this in the past. I have written about violence, and it made me think a lot about that aspect of my work, the kind of language I use, the kind of language I evoked. And it's a difficult problem, one that I would welcome a full discussion of it at some OIH panel. But at least, I mean, come back at me if you want about this. But for now, I'm still thinking that evocation of disgust is not the same as evocation of violence. Am I wrong?
Well, but I guess, I mean, if the disgust you evoke is a disgust of people who then become othered and sort of like, like if it sort of reinforces, racial ideas or something like that, maybe. But I don't know, Jay, if we have to stop. I don't know when this cuts off. So
no, you can go on, because if it's okay with the panel, this is such an important and enthralling discussion, and we have 2 more questions. I don't want to stop. So if you folks, the audience, have places to go, feel free. And I do have people in the queue, but I don't want to cut short this conversation. So Brooke, please go ahead, complete what you're saying.
I mean, that was just my thought. I mean, it's one thing to make TAF disgusting. And that stuff is really disgusting. And that doesn't seem to be sort of morally problematic. But I'm just thinking more in terms of like, if your reader shares some of the same, assumptions about racial others, if that evocative work inadvertently even could contribute to their prejudices. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. I'm at pains, as all of us who do this kind of work are, to contextualize it, to say these are the perceptions. These are the perceptions of white men who come into these places, and with their own arrogance, with their own sense of power, their own racism, make these observations about the disgusting bodies of others. It's a way of deflating them, at least in theory. It's a way of criticizing them. But if the mere evocation of what they said is itself part of the process of exploiting their subjects, then yeah, that's a worrying thing. I wonder what other people have to say about that, about that distinction I've made. Am I doing that out of convenience to myself so I can go ahead and continue making these evocations? Am I assuming too much to assume that by evoking them, I'm also criticizing them, by saying that these are perceptions, by calling them what they are, which is racist, as I do in the book? Is that enough to defang them, to make them less morally problematic than Brooke's suggesting they might be?
We have a 2-finger question from Chris, and then we have Jyoti and Andrew with 1-finger question. So we'll stick around a little longer. I hope that's okay with the panelists. Chris.
Yeah, I think I counted my fingers right. But on that, I think the axis is not just the one that you, Andy, you and Brooke have been discussing, but also the one between writer and reader. And I think that part of what you can do is not only to generate that reading experience in Brooke, but hopefully then to provoke her to ask why, when she read your book about Hiroshima, she wasn't similarly revulsed, right? Physically sort of revulsed, or why, because as historians, we write about sort of all kinds of forms of violence that are visceral, but we sort of eviscerate them, right, in our writing process. And we are trained as readers, right, not to be revulsed by certain kinds of things. And so, to encounter disgust because it's about, sort of food or smell or something, I hope you then push us the next step to sort of say, we might read about Hiroshima in the same way too. That would be my point. I can't wait to come to this panel.
Okay, great. We have a question from Jyoti and Andrew, and we are sticking around longer, but just to try and be precise. And Andrew, also to you, try and be precise in your answers.
Hi, Andy. It's good
Jyoti,
to...
go ahead.
Hey, Jyoti, how are you?
Good, thanks. I have to admit I haven't gotten around reading your book, but I still remember being one of the audience members when you shared your evolving ideas at Colgate. So I have a couple of things I wanted to ask, one of which you kind of alluded to, so I'm not sure if you want to necessarily talk about that, but it was about these ideas of local ideas of purity and pollution, which the British encountered. And as we're talking about disciplining of senses by the British, or structuring of these senses in particular ways, I was thinking of how those local ideas intersect with what the British try to do. Clearly, they're not completely able to displace them. So, what are the limitations of disciplining senses in the empire? That was one question that I had in mind. And the other one was, and as you know, this is not the world that I work on. I'm somebody who does medieval and early modern South Asia. But I was wondering, by the time you come to the mid-19th century, there's at least a 2-century-old corpus, historical corpus, writings about this part of the world that have been generated by all kinds of Europeans. And I was wondering to what extent that understanding and that knowledge informs the ideas about the senses at this time. I mean, are people do they come with preconceived notions of what they're going to encounter? And then those personal encounters reinforce what they had already read about India, or is it something different? So just those two questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Jyoti. Yeah, I did just in response to the first question. Yeah, absolutely. That they are the British are vexed by what they see as various caste conflicts and limitations, all of which they're more than happy to exacerbate themselves, as you know, having to do with purity and pollution. But this means that the sort of relatively high caste Indians with whom the British have most of their encounter have their own ideas about what's allowed and what isn't, and especially in terms of commensality of eating together, and touch, and so how they regard the British is rather, half the book, or I wish it could be half the book. I have less on it than I wish I did, just for lack of sources. But this often comes together at these great banquets that the British have, and you get plenty of commentary about how the British go away from these banquets hosted by Maharajas and things, laughing to themselves or sickened by what they see as the practices of these sort of jokey, recapitulations of how the meals were served and how everything was in the wrong dish and how it all came out at the same time. And you never do that. You serve courses. So there's all that criticism of various Indian practices. But the Indians are appalled by any number of things the British do that violate their sense of what is polluting behavior and what is and what isn't polluting behavior. And certainly the British practices having to do with the toilet have much to do with it, and British practices of bathing do too. First of all, the British don't bathe nearly as often as the Indians do, and the Indians think the British should. And second, they bathe in such a way as to immerse them for a time in the same still water, which can't possibly make them clean. If you're going to be clean, you're going to be in rushing water. Everyone knows that. That only makes good sense. And so this is a constant back and forth. And I do, as I say, I include as much of this as possible. Some of it comes from more sympathetic British sources, but it is clear enough. I should say too that one of the things I do in the book to try to get at some of this is to read anthropology. This is something I've done for some years. And I mean, if you think, Mark, that diplomatic historians are sort of messed up about their, their way forward, read some anthropology sometime. I mean, these people are just at a sort of paralysis of guilt about positionality and subjectivity and gazing at the other and all kinds of stuff. So, but anyway, I mean, you can read a lot of what I find to be fascinating sort of ethnography about India and the Philippines that as a historian, as an outsider, I find myself willing to trust in ways that perhaps anthropologists aren't. So that's some of it. And then the second question, preconceived notions. Yes, they do come with preconceived notions, but what they say again and again, we're speaking mostly of the British in India here, they're not quite prepared for what they see as, what they describe as the assault on their senses. They can read whatever they read, and they do read a lot. And not everything they read is critical of India or Indians. I mean, there's this whole, kind of Orientalist corpus that developed in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. It says, this was a great civilization. It could be a great civilization again. In the end, that's the basis of deciding that it's worth the effort. As mean-spirited and cruel and blundering as the effort toward civilization was, it was based on the premise that it could work, that these were people who were susceptible to change, who could be reformed, or at least some segment of them could be reformed. And so they come with that. But the sensory stuff is much more immediate and, to use a word I think Chris and Ben both used, visceral. And they'll often say, I heard what this was like, but you can't know until you're here. You can't know until you experience it. And so much of it is encounter in sort of bare life in the tropics as they see it. The tropics are terrifying to them. The size of the insects, the depth and the smell of the mud, all of that stuff is deeply experiential and can't be conveyed by anything they would have read before they got there.
Thanks so much, Andy. We have one last question from Andrew.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rotter, for this fascinating talk and for generously agreeing to stay on a little bit longer for us. My question's really quick, and the answer might be pretty straightforward in that, the point of your book is in part to be a provocateur and to provoke us to think about these larger questions. But I guess my question is, how might this story change if we looked at other spaces of colonial comparison? So you have two really good examples, and it helps that you have a very clear endpoint for them with India and the Philippines, which become independent nations within about 13 months of each other. But what if we took, say, Bermuda and Puerto Rico, both ongoing colonial territories of the United States and Great Britain, and how this story then extends into the sort of era of decolonization and beyond it, during which the relationship between the metropole and the colony changes to being one of, say, like a tourist economy. How does that history of the census change in the era of decolonization while colonialism continues in this era? So yeah, the question again, how might this story change if we looked at other points of and spaces of colonial comparison?
Yeah, I love that question, and I hope someone will do it. About Bermuda, I know very little. About Puerto Rico, yeah, Puerto Rico is in some sense a laboratory for what the Americans end up doing in the Philippines, especially with regard to public health and sanitation. That many of the things they do first or start first in Puerto Rico, they then transport to the Philippines. So I said earlier, and I think it's still true, that these efforts begin in the metropole and then go outward to the colony and then come back. In this case, there's some of these efforts are staged first in Cuba and Puerto Rico and then get sent to the Philippines. In fact, some of the same people who were involved in imperial control and pest control and disease control in the Caribbean are ultimately sent out to the Philippines, taking with them the lessons they learned there. So I think the story in Puerto Rico might be very similar. What you raise about these becoming tourist economies is, a really fascinating difference that I'm just not prepared to guess about, except to say that one would think that in the service of bringing people to Puerto Rico, and Dennis Merrill has written about this in interesting ways about tourism in Puerto Rico, you want to downplay the smells of the place, the seeming awfulness, the tropicality of it, the danger, the threat that a place like this would hold, and talk about the exotic beauty of it, the tradition of it, the opportunities there, the beaches, all of those things. And to some extent, this happens, of course, in India and the Philippines as well. But I would guess the emphasis would be even more strongly to try to erase a past of sensory revulsion in tourist spots like Puerto Rico and Bermuda. But great question. Sounds like an article for Modern American History to me. Brooke.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, thanks to our panelists, thanks to our author, thanks to the audience. This was an extremely enthralling conversation. So please join me in thanking Andrew, Chris, and Ben. We can use the reactions here. We can do the physical applause because we are not together in the same space. Thank you all. And if you have not seen it in the chat, we are going to meet again as a work in progress seminar in March, which actually Andrew is one of our presenters, and he finished a brilliant PhD under Brooke just a few months ago. So thank you, everybody. I hope to see some of you in March. And until next time, stay safe and bye.
Bye. Thank you.
See you later, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay, Ben, Chris, especially. It was just great.
Indeed.